One of the most controversial aspects about Sons of Liberty was the abrupt jump from playing as Solid Snake to Raiden. In this, part 4 of our retrospective, Existence, we'll be discussing why it arguably actually makes MGS2 a masterpiece of the digital age. The plant chapter opens with some foreshadowing of this shift, with a quote by the Information and Technology exhibit in the Smithsonian. If Solid Snake and Big Boss are synonymous with the nuclear age and the rise of modern genetics, Raiden, this hints, will be synonymous with the age of information. This tells us that as a sequel, MGS2 will ultimately be about descendants, and how one period becomes another. It will be about not genetic any longer, but mimetic transmission, and how even two things as seemingly unrelated, if not opposites, as computers, symbolic of the Pax Americana at the turn of the 21st century, and atomic bombs, symbolic of the Cold War at the mid-20th century, were born as brothers, fathered by the War of Liberty, World War II, at the end and beginning, respectively, of the so-called American century. Even the phrasing here, grew up together, is a subtle hint in this context towards Dawkins' meme theory. After all, memes are modeled on genes, and through the process of mimicry, memes can be said to grow up and get passed on. In a word, evolve. However, evolution does not necessarily imply improvement. Where artificial selection occurs, often a descendant is much more pathetic and less fit than its ancestor. Just compare, say, pugs to wolves. What human beings choose to keep alive and select for can alter the course of evolution dramatically, and that is what we see with Raiden. You'll remember Liquid Snake referred to the Genome Army at the end of MGS1 as digital beings created to mimic the genes of Big Boss. Raiden is the next step, not a genetic but mimetic mimic. This presents a bold and dramatic underlying theory we might call digital selection. Raiden is a version of Snake purged of its substance. This we can see hinted at metaphorically just by his pale skin and colorless hair. He is all but a newborn at the beginning of the game, a cosplayer, only posing as his hero. But Raiden's extensive use of VR training has blurred the line between mimicry and reality, imitator and imitated. His ego, his entire sense of self, is something all but installed or downloaded. The opening line of the chapter, after all, isn't by Raiden, it's something Raiden's being uploaded with, so to speak, by an equally artificial Colonel Campbell, really an AI program. Raiden and Colonel discuss the so-called facts of the famous tanker incident, but what the player knows, yet they do not, is that, like Raiden relative to Snake, these facts are facts in name only. They function as the facts, in place of them, but they do not reflect them, only barely enough resemble them. Consider that the plant chapter opens on the one of the two bridges from the tanker chapter we didn't actually see. It's close enough of a mimic in this context that we recognize its relevance to the previous chapter's events, yet the fact remains this is not the right bridge, or the right Snake, or the right memory. These aren't the right helicopters either. It's like everything has reset and randomly regenerated anew again. A sort of virtual new world. This enacts onto the player the whiplash effect of the digital age, where truths exist deprived of context and even of substance. Some of the opening lines are ironic in a way neither speakers comprehend. The cleanup, for example, is spoken of as literal, but the player playing the game for a second time will know it's metaphorical. The Patriots, after all, sent Ocelot during the tanker incident. to clean up the mess of a Marine-made Metal Gear project and frame Snake for a catastrophe that in fact never took place. So in a sense, Ocelot was also cleaning up the mess of Snake and Hal attempting to hijack the flow of information by publicizing Ray, a weapons project the Patriots didn't want, let alone want people to know about. Even the phrase, "a symbol of environmental protection," is a masterful use of irony by the writers. The Big Shell is actually Arsenal gear in disguise, a literal yet also metaphorical environmental filtration system, one that protects the intellectual environment, cleanses context, washes clean minds.
By deleting such information, the Patriots can shape the course of history as they see fit.
Snake, do you remember the sinking of that tanker 2 years ago?
Of course.
Raiden's actual words could pass for things that Snake might say, but the actor Quentin Flynn's hilarious delivery draws attention to exactly the quote-unquote wrong thing, thereby altering the entire context.
What are their demands?
$30 billion.
$30 billion? What makes them think they can get that much?
In a spy story or game, typically the fundamental principle is maintaining the fiction. But MGS2 does not. In this deepest of all ironies, this means this is, in a way, the real Snake, not the character, but the normal person wearing Snake's mask by play acting as him. In other words, you and me. The phrase fourth wall breaking is insufficient. MGS2 removes it. There is hardly any fourth wall left to break. It's left as thin and as virtually invisible as virtual reality. This same collapse of simulation with reality intrudes on us in the form of Dead Cell, a former Navy SEAL anti-terrorist training squad who've become the very thing they weren't supposed to be, terrorists. The same is true of the presence of Gorlukovich's forces, who were fighting for Russian nationalism, yet in the 2 years since have seemingly become a private army without a nation, faceless phantoms. The Navy SEALs sieged the Big Shell in a mimic of Gorlukovich's forces during the tanker incident through fast roping and rapid heliborne deployment. The government-sponsored tour that gets the president and other VIPs taken capture in the plant echoes the UN-recognized inspection that got Snake and other VIPs, so to speak, caught up in the Patriots' web back during the tanker. You wouldn't have any of this extensive mimicry and similarity yet difference without the two scenarios, the two chapters, the two protagonists. The duplication, but in name only, represents the binary logic manifested in the Twin Towers themselves, which French philosopher Jean Baudrillard observed himself in a paper reflecting on the events of September 11th. The Twin Towers were virtually identical except being two different buildings, filled as they were with two different interiors, two different substances. Playing for the first time, you're likely to assume the president that's been taken hostage is the same president that Ocelot's talking to at the end of both previous MGS episodes. This is exactly like Raiden replacing Snake. The role of the president is always the same, but the identity of the official always changing, dare I say evolving, through artificial selection, through elections and democracy. We see a similar sort of wordplay with the difference between Dead Cell and their real-world SEAL Team 6 affiliated analog, Red Cell. Likewise, this entire scenario mimics both prior MGS's, Shadow Moses, and tanker incidents combined. The toxic soup that Campbell warns us of as the worst-case scenario actually describes the Patriots' view of the world without them in place to clean up its environment. A toxic soup where not even natural, let alone artificial, selection can really take place. Meanwhile, the entire opening gradually realigns with that of MGS1, from laying out our two mission objectives to the image of so-called Snake swimming up above us. But certain aspects have either been distorted or scrambled across the, shall I say, mimetic transmission gap. Raiden's breathing apparatus resembles, in a sort of dreamlike surrealism, one of Snake's cigarettes blown up to ridiculous size, implying breathing in not oxygen, but the byproduct of burning both tobacco and carbon-containing fuels, carbon monoxide. Meanwhile, Raiden's mask and even his voice bring to mind at first not Snake at all, but Psychomantis.
This is Snake. I'm now inside Strut A of Shell 1.
What do you think now? Can you feel my power now?
We get some of the simplicity of language, signature of digital machines, and computer languages, much as we did across the various decks of the tanker with our first area, Strut A, Shell 1. There are 2 shells, there are 2 snakes. But much like the player, the idea of 2 snakes, one heroic, the other little more than a lackey, isn't something the kernel will acknowledge. The existence of the real Solid Snake is need-to-know information Raiden will only be permitted to learn and register as a fact, along with the player, when the time is right. Quantifying thought, controlling behavior, that is what this entire exercise is designed to prove. All the more reason why Raiden is so necessary to MGS2 as a revolutionary grand experiment. Raiden's difference from Snake is something he'll have to be exposed to, hence the necessity for the appearance of Solid Snake himself, hence the necessity of gaining a new name and identity, one contrary to Snake, as Raiden. The same ironic wordplay continues throughout the opening. For example, the skull suit Raiden wears is described in a way that doubles as a description for the Patriots' mind control, and the information, or material they drape him in, to protect against a wide range of toxic substances, namely truths. It's a kind of extended phenotype in Dawkinsian speak, a parasitic extension of Raiden that only adds by subtraction and erasure. By draining him, literally, of his blood, of his life force, the real Raiden, the human, naked Raiden, is the ultimate toxic substance the suit was built to protect against. Only after being stripped out of it will Raiden come to discover who he really is.
Skull suit seems appropriate somehow.
The circular hatch here is to convey an uncanny sense that we haven't left the tanker at all. Raiden is to Snake what the big shell will prove to be to the tanker, its living memory, imperfect yet the bare minimum of similarity for us to recognize it as in some sense the same. To the logic of a computer, this would effectively make them one and the same. But human beings are not computers, nor are we weapons. The glaring differences between Raiden and Snake, I argue, are there to prove this point. What MGS2's Raiden does to MGS1's Snake, the information age of the American century has done to truth, and to human nature. Arguably. And that brings us to the first story in Paul Auster's New York trilogy, City of Glass. It opens by telling us it was a wrong number that started it all. This, we'll see, is just like Raiden being misdialed, miscast as it were, as Solid Snake. The story starts with Daniel Quinn, a writer living in Manhattan. Quinn writes detective stories about a heroic character named Max Work, which Quinn publishes under the pseudonym William Wilson, and thereby hides behind not one but 2 different pseudo-identities. The plot kicks into motion when, Hideo Kojima style, the fourth wall isn't so much broken as it is removed. Someone calls Quinn and asks for someone with the same name as the actual writer of the book that we are reading, Paul Auster. Except the caller seems to have made the same mistake as Raiden, and soon enough as Daniel Quinn. He mistakes the author as its detective, man-of-action protagonist, mistakes Paul Auster not as a writer of a book about a writer of detective stories, but as the real deal, an actual detective. Quinn, who already feels more at home in the identities of Max Work or William Wilson than in his own skin, for reasons we'll know soon enough, decides to accept this new big shell of an identity and begins to impersonate a Paul Auster who's never existed, as merely his namesake, a Paul Auster PI. As Auster, he agrees to meet the caller and comes to find a beautiful woman named Virginia Stillman. She, in turn, was not the real client, but merely his proxy. She introduces Quinn as Auster to the real client, her husband, Peter Stillman. Except this isn't the real Peter Stillman, we're soon told, just as he isn't the real Paul Auster, and just as Raiden won't be the real Snake. No, this is the real Stillman's son and his namesake. His meme became flesh. And the real Peter Stillman Sr., is the man his son fears is coming to murder him now. What makes all this especially painful to Daniel Quinn is that he himself lost a son and feels responsible for his death. The boy's name? It was Peter. Stillman Jr. tells Quinn that his father, Peter Stillman Sr., was once a famous academic who became obsessed with the idea of a prelapsarian language, a way of undoing the inherited curse of Babel and the fall of man from Eden. In a book by Herman Melville called Redburn, the American dream was once expressed like this: "The curse of Babel shall be revoked, a new Pentecost will come, and the language they speak shall be the language of Britain." End quote. In a way, Stillman Sr. takes this ideal both seriously and literally. He becomes obsessed with anniversaries and recurrences over long stretches of time, going all the way back to the earliest era of European settlements in America. Like the Patriots' attempt to break down the barrier between words and what they refer to in reality, Stillman resolved to experiment on his own son, Peter Stillman Jr., to create a living being that was still speaking the language and words of God. He decides to lock the very young Peter Jr. in a dark room and never let him out. The father believed by keeping his son and namesake locked up in the skull suit-like protection of the dark room, safe from language itself, that someday the boy would emerge speaking that one true tongue. But something happens along the way, something Stillman Jr. doesn't recall, doesn't understand. Whatever it was, the boy was eventually taken out of the locked room, and his father sent to a locked room of his own, sent to jail. Now he's been freed from that locked room. And Quinn, in accepting this mission to find the father and monitor him to keep the son safe, unconsciously is attempting to reverse the hands of time himself and save a son rather than killing him, as he feels he did to his own boy, Peter. In this way, Quinn, just like Stillman Sr., wants to be reborn as perfect, white, untarnished by reality, almost as little more than a skull. Yet, as Quinn finds the father, Stillman, and tries to untangle the mess of confusion surrounding the man's seemingly unhinged, random, incomprehensible activities, like walking around Manhattan to spell out with his footsteps the phrase Tower of Babel, Quinn slowly transforms, like Peter Jr., into a namesake, a meme, just another version of Peter Sr., a crazy man too obsessed with the pursuit of his truth to bother to even eat or sleep. The story gradually shifts identities much like its protagonist, going from a detective story to meaningless jumbles in Quinn's Red Notebook. The notebook ends with an unanswered riddle: what will happen when there are no more pages in the Red Notebook? Then it's revealed the entire story is actually being relayed to us by a former friend of a character that Quinn meets along the way, a writer named, you guessed it, Paul Auster. That's right, the author of the story briefly enters its narrative as a character before showing back up in recursive secondhand form like this at the end. The unnamed friend of Auster actually ended their friendship over Auster not doing enough, in his view, to help Quinn. Every character, in other words, one after the other, up to and including the author, Paul Auster himself, disappears into the very fabric of the story. The more they try to enlarge their possession, their arsenals of the truth, the more they shrink into nothingness before becoming something less than real. Recurrent imagery showcases the city of Manhattan covered in snow. It's as if the city has devoured them, eaten them, subsumed them into its invisible locked room, its city of glass. And ironically, the last line somewhat mimics the first. We began with, "It was a wrong number that started it," and we end with, "And wherever he, as in Quinn, may have disappeared to, I wish him luck." After all, it was a kind of luck that, to paraphrase Rick from Casablanca, of all the telephone numbers that Virginia could have called, she called his. A similar disappearing act we can see with MGS2's third Peter Stillman, a man who claims to be a famous bomb disposal expert, and who we gradually learn has been faking a handicap out of guilt for a bomb disposal gone wrong. Yet who we never really know for sure if he's the real deal, the real Peter Stillman, or only his namesake, his meme, his mimic. When we confront the Mad Bomber Fat Man, he tells us that the real Peter Stillman died. After fighting Fat Man, if we drag his body, he drops a dog tag with the name Peter Stillman. Which was the real Peter Stillman, and which the illusion? We'll never know. That, after all, is the nature of the City of Glass, Manhattan, and life in the postmodern age. What you think you see is only as real as your brain tells you it is, as what you have faith in. The Patriots are a kind of ongoing fiction too, come to think of it. Listen, don't obsess over words so much. Hear me, you Peter Stillmans, you Daniel Quinns, you authors, essayists, and detectives. Hear me, myself. Find the meaning behind the words. And they're always behind the words, not in the words themselves. Then decide. That way you can find your own name, own words, and the sound of your own future. Decide for yourself, and whatever you choose will be you. A promo poster for MGS2 from E3 2001 used art taken from an 1822 book depicting the myth theme of the world-bearing turtle. This myth theme appears in many world religions, from Hinduism to Chinese and even Native American beliefs, but it may best be known today as the turtle from the famous meme, Turtles All the Way Down. If the world rests on the turtle's shoulders, this expression conveys by shorthand, what keeps the turtle upright? Why, another turtle, of course. It's an expression that conveys the idea of recursion, of self-reference. If anyone in the world can be borne by the strong shoulders of Snake, who keeps him upright? Why, another snake, of course. It's snakes and turtles all the way down, even if some of them are actually named Raiden. Another secret possible meaning behind the MGS3 idea is a reference to codons, which are always nucleotides bundled in threes. Exons are the three that make it into a codon, while introns are the ones in the sequence that must be eliminated for them, the exons, to do so. The concept of mimetic transmission is featured in the gameplay by way of MGS2's guard comms mechanics, and you could use the M9 trank gun, or later any weapon, to destroy the sentry's radio, cutting them off like Solidus wants to cut off and annex Manhattan, a la Saddam Hussein and Kuwait in the early 90s. The persistence of dead or neutralized enemies also expresses this theme of covering up the truth you won't allow to be passed on. We begin Sons of Liberty's wider themes with the naivete of Otacon, who full-heartedly mistakes information for truth. He's convinced that obtaining on-site photographic evidence of a new next-gen Metal Gear under development by the Marine Corps will throw a wrench in the proliferation of such technology. But Hal and Snake quickly realize they're in over their heads when a group of former Soviet roughnecks hijack the tanker with the clear intention of stealing the new Metal Gear. It's crucial to notice two things about the tanker when it comes to Hal. Otacon constantly misinterprets things, and he even occasionally only tells a half-truth, all the while championing the intrinsic power of truth over untruth. Hal hilariously misreads the meaning of virtually every Chinese parable that he's presumably downloaded offline, and he neglects until you reach the bridge to mention that he didn't really hack the intel out of the Pentagon's network initially. He was fed the story by someone claiming to be his long-lost sister, EE, who severed all ties with him under, shall I say, compromising circumstances. He only hacks the Pentagon after this contact. Hal epitomizes the typical overzealous net user addressed by the Patriots at the end of the game. Even when he isn't actively trying to suppress certain information to feel more like a digital-born badass, he doesn't have enough wisdom or humility to recognize his own limits, or the limits of so-called truth. It's not all Hal's fault, of course. The point MGS2 is making is that the flow of information drowns out context, dragging information fragments to float together, all out of context, on the open sea, so to speak. When half of what you think you know about the world isn't actually learned but merely obtained as data, you've skipped the actual necessary step that constitutes the basis for any real knowledge. You have instead contextless information, which, anyway, accumulates far faster than your ability to process it properly or to sort fact from fiction. Without grounding your interpretations in the requisite context, you wind up no differently than an AI who's come face to face with the frame problem. That is, the problem of common sense inferences in the absence of basic contextual unspoken axioms, meaning starting principles. The internet sells us the idea that we can pick and choose our axioms, our basic frame of how to understand or interpret the world at will. But this makes a commodity out of the process. You can use the free-floating nature of information to ignore any aspects of empirical reality that you refuse to perceive through the necessary axioms that you've rejected.
Remove you from the fear that goes with battle situations. War is a video game. What better way to raise the ultimate soldier?
Take Hal. His axioms, for starters, are anyone can find the truth in the sea of information. But in truth, this is a cover for his real axiom that suggests he, Hal, can become virtually all-powerful and all-knowing, like both a character in a story and the person writing it. And as we inevitably learn, all this really is about is avoiding the pain of his total inability to reverse what he did with EE's mom, and what terrible fate it both instantiated and released onto his father and his sister. The system makes the things that we'd rather forget, ironically, just as permanently accessible as the escapist power fantasies that we need to cling to repress them. Instead of dealing with reality and learning how to move on, we're trapped in a yesterday much worse than the one that may have actually existed. This only drives our escapism more, poisoning us, then offering that very same poison as the cure. The same thing we can see with the proliferation of Metal Gear itself. Instead of coming to terms with how the US military-industrial complex are the cause of creating Metal Gear in the first place, the establishment can't dare to do so, because their enemies won't come to terms with the ugly truth that by using or trying to obtain Metal Gears themselves, they lose any moral high ground. The only alternative is for both sides to pursue Metal Gear proliferation. Something similar is afoot with the Marines and Navy. In the post-Cold War, the necessity for either naval-oriented force has dramatically lessened. They're both all but obsolete now, but instead of facing this painful loss of purpose, both would rather work to reinvent themselves. In other words, refusing to accept they're both no longer needed. The exact same refusal to face reality we also find with the forces of Grlukovich, who would rather risk nuclear war than accept Russia's defeat. Olga refuses to accept a pregnant woman probably shouldn't be in a combat zone, while Sergei refuses to accept his daughter is not a defenseless child anymore. And on the cycle of denial goes. But the ultimate case of living, breathing denial is of course Raiden. Consumed by the tragedy that was his origin as a child soldier in Liberia, Raiden flees into simulacra. He wills to become a blank, empty shell, a cipher, a digital dog of war. Yet he nearly misses the chance to start a real-life family with the woman of his dreams, Rose, who, despite having secrets of her own, genuinely seemingly wants to be let into Raiden's true life. And of course there's Solidus, a man so in denial he's decided to just ignore how the actual Sons of Liberty's revolution worked out and start the whole program all over again, in the same time and place as well. The terrorists following him, Dead Cell, are consumed by the death of their real leader, so they've taken on this prosthetic idol of Solidus instead. Peter Stillman can't face what really happened in that church bombing. Fortune can't come to terms with why bad things happen without a reason, even when they happen in threes. And even Olga, in the plant mission, hasn't learned from her father's death, deciding instead to embark on a path that leaves her corpse floating in or around the same body of water as Sergei. We never actually see what happens to Olga's body. Ocelot, remember, wears his black armband to remember the death of Big Boss. He uses this grief to fuel his secret triple crossings and false identities, and disinformation campaigns, maybe more adept at utilizing information to conceal reality than anyone else. And last but not least, there are the Patriots themselves, never built to process the demise of their own context, instead of processing that they too, even as AIs, must be on some level as flawed as their human creators. The Patriots in their wisdom elect to look down on their own progenitors as the next stage in human evolution. But nothing about either the Patriots or their information filtration system is really real. It's all a circular process that can't rid junk faster than it's accumulating. Trying to rid the world of an awareness of that junk is precisely the impulse, as we see with Hal in the tanker mission, that generates that junk information and all those half-truths to begin with. Raiden personifies the key concept for MGS2 of context.
あとはやっぱりスネークっていうキャラクターをもう少し、深みを持たせたかったというのがありまして、どうしてもプレイヤーにしてしまうと自分なんですよね。スネークイコール自分っていうことになってくるとあまりキャラクターを描けない、そのプレイヤーに、従ってしまいますから、新しいキャラクターをプレイヤーにすることで、すごく、スネークを客観的に見ることができると。
We might compare Raiden to the characters Taihei and Matashichi from legendary director Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress. The film, released in 1958, is actually about the characters General Makabe Rokurota and Princess Yuki sneaking across enemy lines under disguised identities in order to save the princess from a war between the two clans Yamana and Akizuki. But the context, the frame for the story, centers not on these two important characters, but on two peasants, Taihei and Matashichi. By telling us the story mostly through the peasants' eyes, we're brought more immersively not only into the story, but into the entire world of the film. Something similar is going on in Metal Gear Solid 2, which is evident from the very start. Raiden is in some sense the shell of the story, Snake's story, just as the peasants were for the princess and the general in the early part of the film. And just like those characters, Raiden gradually, over the course of the story, grows into a character in his own right, gains an actual substance that isn't just a reference to someone or something else. But Raiden's purpose also goes beyond the question of framing the story and into the differences that are unique to video games from all other mediums. The difficulty is that we by necessity only get to experience a specific sequence in a player character's life. Even though we're supposed to be functionally one and the same for the duration of the game, there are almost always, by necessity, elements in our player character's story outside the purview of interaction. In Kojima's adventure game Snatcher, the player character Gillian Seed has amnesia. In the game's spiritual successor Policenauts, player character Jonathan Ingram, prior to the game, gets lost in cryogenic hibernation and floats through space for 28 years. Both examples work around this inherent essential gap in different ways, and so too does the inclusion of Raiden. Raiden starts out a blank empty void, who only gradually gets filled in with substance the further we progress. Like I said, this not only solves the gap between player and player character in a clever way, much more importantly for MGS2, it speaks to the digital age. When you first take a new computer out of the box, it's more or less identical with anyone else's. But the more that you use it, the more it becomes an aspect of your virtual identity, more filled in with this facsimile of substance called data. The same, to an extent, is true of Raiden. One of the biggest criticisms of the character is that he's a wimp. Why would we want to play as Raiden and not Snake, this argument goes. Well, since Snatcher and the original MSX Metal Gears, Kojima has consistently said that he doesn't just make games to be fun, to help players pass the time. His lifelong goal has always been to make games as a new form of cultural transmission, as something that actually has meaning, that has the right to its existence. And from the document of MGS2, most of the staff at KCE Japan who worked on MGS2 felt exactly the same. Raiden, much more than Snake ever could, is a symbol for the modern age, for what essayist George W.S. Trower called in 1980, the context of no context.
Solidus raised plenty of other child soldiers. Do you know why we chose you over them? It was because you were the only one who refused to acknowledge the past. All the others remember what they were and pay for it daily.
But you turn your back on everything you don't like.
Raiden, we're told, is a narcissist, more or less. He starts out exactly the opposite as Snake from MGS1, as someone who sincerely believes in pretending to think that America is a force for good, that it's a protector, that both it and he are protectors of the virtuous, sources of justice and truth and liberty. Most of all, though, Raiden believes in a ready-made truth. He hangs on Colonel's every word in the beginning like the mesmerized member of a Hollywood audience. He projects a version of himself onto the world, a purified ego, a contextless self. Raiden is virtually allergic to the idea of having a past. He's incapable of independent thought. He wants, on some level, to be deceived. Raiden, for all these reasons, is the perfect protagonist for Sons of Liberty because he epitomizes the American character at the turn of the century. Raiden is someone who wants to be real in name only, who wants existence to resemble nothing more than a Hollywood movie, something to pass the time, to distract him from what he doesn't want to see. His name, Jack, refers to more than just Leonardo DiCaprio's character in Titanic or the infamous killer Jack the Ripper. It also seems to refer to Tom Clancy's everyman protagonist, Jack Ryan.
I can't make it tonight.
Where are you going?
I can't tell you that.
Jack, tell her where you're going. In fact, tell her who you work for. She'll be impressed.
I work for the CIA, and the director asked me at the last minute to come with him to Russia to do a nuclear arms inspection.
That is so lame.
Jack Ryan serves as the main character in almost all of Clancy's official novels.
Some say the greatest threat to America.
These drug cartels represent a clear and present danger to the national security of the United States.
Comes from other nations. Some say the greatest threat to America.
The course of action I'd suggest is a course of action I can't suggest.
Comes from within.
We are 2 minutes to target. Looks like we've got our own little war.
Harrison Ford is Jack Ryan.
I'm appointing Ryan the acting deputy director, intelligence.
The finding clearly states that our assistance is limited to supply and advice only.
He doesn't know about it, Bobby.
No troops, then?
No troops.
He needs to know nothing. He's gonna know nothing.
The laws he swore to uphold are at risk.
The explosion here rocked the ranch of Enrique Rojas less than an hour ago.
You said it was going to be a surgical strike. That's a kid they just brought out on NBC. Why was I left out of it?
You see everything in black and white.
Not black and white. Right and wrong.
Both Jacks are family men with good American values. They hate the enemy and love freedom, not to mention the president. They're held up as heroes, yet they lack the realness, the bravery, the autonomy of a real hero, something only MGS2 is willing to admit. They're written as faceless everymen, serving as the reader or player's proxy. This too is something only MGS2 is willing to admit. Raiden assumes that his side always has the moral high ground, and when it doesn't, he ditches that aspect of himself to fill it in with another just as readily made half-truth, another pseudo-identity. And that's what makes him so easy to deceive. He's uncomfortable with doing anything remotely deceptive, and yet he's a covert operator. He resents being lied to, not because he hates lying itself, but actually, ironically, because he hates being reminded of the distinction between a lie and the truth. You might say he loves deception so much that he hates being reminded of it. Just listen to Raiden and Pliskin talk about VR.
Any field experience?
No, not really.
So this is your first.
I've had extensive training, the kind that's indistinguishable from the real thing.
Like what?
Sneaking mission 60, weapons 80, advanced
VR, huh?
But realistic in every way.
A virtual grunt of the digital age, that's just great.
That's far more effective than live exercises.
You don't get injured in VR, do you? Every year a few soldiers die in field exercises.
There's pain sensation in VR and even a sense of reality and urgency. The only difference is it isn't actually happening.
Now listen to Raiden and Rose talk about his room.
Are you satisfied now? There wasn't anyone there, was there?
No. No, there was no one there. There was absolutely no one in your room. Not another woman, not me, not even you.
Raiden represents the type of personality that you arguably have to have today not to go insane. The effect MGS2 has of unraveling the player's sense of its reality could only ever work if that sense was built on lies and self-deceit. If MGS1 Snake secretly enjoyed the killing, Raiden enjoys the lying. In our era, where warfare has been deprived of its substance, and the individual exists only so far as what can be represented in a quantifiable form as data, Raiden epitomizes this modern existence. Fortunately, MGS2 doesn't leave it there. Raiden learns from one teacher after the next.
All I could think about was hiding from the crime, shielding myself from the public outcry. I wanted people to be sorry for me, for my weakness. I faked being a victim myself because I couldn't bear to face the families of the real victims. This is no prosthetic. I can keep my footing on catwalks and hike over deserts. I lived my life so well, I haven't even answered to myself for my sins. It was supposed to be a shield, and it's become a shroud instead. I've killed my soul by playing the victim. Instead of protecting me, it's made my life even more hellish.
What good can that do the victims?
I know. I'm a coward.
Hey, Pete.
God forgive me.
From Stillman to Pliskin to Ames, the President, EE, Hal, Solidus, and eventually even the Patriot AIs, how to think for himself and how to face all the bad and all the good. Instead of staying a digitally selected half-human being, Raiden learns that truly existing doesn't require being always right, or agreeable, or feeling like you're living in a movie. It just requires struggling with oneself and facing oneself to gain the right to having an honest and true and full belief, to having faith, in other words, to having the will. This hard-fought lesson would have been less poignant and less clear playing as anybody else, most of all if we were playing as Snake. Raiden learns that other people, from Rose to Snake to even Dead Cell, Solidus, and the Patriots, exist outside of him, that their respective points of view also matter, even if they aren't 100% true. In the end, both Solidus and Raiden, Patriot AIs call our beloved monsters, but Raiden fights anyway. He defeats Solidus, not because he's ordered to or because it serves his version of a politically correct interpretation of reality, and not because Raiden any longer deludes himself into thinking that he's superior or that he doesn't lie, because Raiden realizes that he has a right to exist once he realizes that fact, whether deemed right or wrong, good or bad. Instead of artificing a sense of self based on half-truths to escape from hurt, Raiden faces himself, struggles with that pain and that conflict to accept his own flaws. He leaves the sandbox and enters the real world. That is how he goes from a substanceless Snake stand-in to standing as his own man. How he obtains a true desire, not merely to be used and to be lied to, and to lie to himself, but to face the full picture of the world, imperfect and messy as it is, and still choose, elect, to believe in something, to pass that something he's found faith in on. MGS2 ends with a moving monologue by Snake about, of all things, communication through technology. Up till now, his speech implies, humanity has used mass information and communication to preserve only the versions of truth we like to see, the politically correct truth, regardless of what our particular version of the politically correct truth is. The half-truths that we'd rather pretend were really 100% real than ever admit they may not be, and acknowledge the existence of other people. But, Snake says, we don't have to feel so insecure. We can admit even the parts of ourselves and of our society that might be construed as bad or wrong or even incomplete. Because right or wrong, good or bad, our existence, our life, obliges us to pass itself on. It may change forms, may change substances, like Snake becoming Raiden and Raiden becoming his own person. But it will keep versions of our past alive, versions that will be real to the humans sending and receiving them, whether they're actually real or not. And they will have value so long as they are genuinely believed. They will be real not because of their inherent truth or morality or political righteousness, but because of their meaningfulness. Raiden is there to show us that what make truth and morality important is that they mean something to people, not what they are in of themselves. The key word here is history. The way only grains of truth about Snake get passed on to the PS2 by way of his mimetic descendant, Raiden, mimics the imperfection of what Dawkins calls mimetic copying fidelity. I will paraphrase Dawkins' words from The Selfish Gene in context for you now. At first glance, it seems memes are not high-fidelity replicators like genes. Every time a content creator encounters an idea in a game and passes it on to somebody else, he, she, or they are likely to change it somewhat. I have made no secret of my debt in this essay series to Richard Dawkins or Hideo Kojima, yet rarely have I repeated them in their own words, and scarcely in their original contexts. I have twisted them around for my own purposes, changing the emphasis, blending them with ideas of my own and my own ideas of those of other people. The memes are only being passed on to you in an altered form. This looks quite unlike gene transmission. It looks as though meme transmission is subject to continuous mutation and also to bending. But the meme can be defined just like the gene, not in a rigid all or none way, but as a unit of convenience. When we say all biologists today believe in Darwin's theory, we don't mean every biologist has in their brain an identical copy of the exact words and context of Charles Darwin himself. Each individual believer has their own way of interpreting their faith. Yet in spite of this, some essence, some unrepresentable underlying essence of Darwinism, or Kojimanism, is present in the head of every individual who understands either genius's work. Now, the Patriot AIs have molded Raiden through digital selection as a version, however imperfect as a copy, of Snake. Solidus assumes this was their end objective, a Solid Snake simulation, but that was itself a case of imperfection and mimicry. Snake was only selected alongside the paradigm of Shadow Moses purely to test whether or not the Patriots could induce in Raiden, as Snake's surrogate, the will to survive, according to their parameters. Ironically, the realization by Raiden that he isn't Snake is precisely what the S3 plan, the selection for societal sanity, is all about. If left to Raiden and Raiden alone, he'd have gone on as an imposter, clinging to the half-truth of his pseudo-identity, his pseudo-liberty. He'd use the freedom offered by the anonymity and lack of filtration or selection of the information age to choose not to face reality. The player's annoyance and frustration with Raiden and how poorly he measures up to Snake is exactly what the entire experience of playing MGS2 is about bringing to light. Why does Raiden start out pretending to be some version of Snake? Because in VR, in the digital facsimile of existence, at no point does he ever have to come into contact with reality, ever have to test this theory about himself, so long as he doesn't will to do so. Getting him to will to do so is what MGS2 as a scenario is all about. Raiden as Snake is precisely the sort of untested truth accumulating in the sandbox of political correctness and value systems that the Patriots want to mitigate. Only by facing the conflict and the hurt that he's been avoiding, only by testing Raiden's notions about himself and of the players through the events and scenarios of the game, only by being exposed to these truths that we'd otherwise never choose to face, does both Raiden and the player gain ostensibly the qualifications to be free, to earn the right to choose and to believe in something. Faith means knowing you could be wrong. Faith requires testing, and this is a premise that before now Raiden would have never been willing to face. MGS2 uses Raiden to ask the player, do we really need machines to do our thinking for us? Do we really want a world where all the inner conflict and the struggle to believe in something get outsourced to a system that's basically running on autopilot? Are we really so weak and insecure that we'd leave the real purpose of existence and of memories to computers? Because if so, Raiden as Snake is what we'll get. We won't even get a say in what has meaning or why. We won't get a say in what happened yesterday or what will happen tomorrow. And unless we face up to our own limitations, while accepting the value of other people's existence, right or wrong, good, bad, or evil, maybe we won't even deserve to. True freedom, like power, as Stan Lee said, comes with responsibility. In all likelihood, the player is not exactly like Snake. If you or I were, what would be the appeal in playing as him? Snake is at best a version of ourselves, a version we willingly have helped create by playing the series, because unlike in mundane reality, as Snake, we actually like what we see. The same is true even more so of identities in the social media age. We're able to adopt personas, to contrive Snake-like versions of ourselves, in this society where the essential boundary between digital and real existence is all but dissolved. As the Patriots say flat out, Raiden is a perfect representative of the masses they need to protect. His presence in MGS2 is there to help the player get to a place mentally where they no longer need protecting, where they can truly understand the responsibility of what it is to be free. I'll leave you with Colonel's biggest fourth-wall-breaking meta-narrative line, which of course doubles sublimely as a statement about MGS2 itself.
Your persona, experiences, triumphs, and defeats are nothing but byproducts. The real objective was ensuring that we could generate and manipulate them. It's taken a lot of time and money, but it was well worth it considering the results.
Both you and I, we were always alone. Always. We only wanted to be loved. We were always waiting. Waiting for somebody. Somebody who would love us, but we were wrong. You can't wait to be loved. You have to go out and find it. 4 years ago, I realized that you can't just wish for a happy family. You have to make it happen. I only wish I knew that sooner. I learned that I could love, as you probably did.